clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Wednesday, April 13th. And yesterday was, if you live in New York or anywhere, it was a pretty crazy news day, but in New York in particular, early in the morning at 8:30 in the morning, as commuters were going on their morning commute, a man entered the subway and carrying weaponry, carrying a smoke bomb, and released the smoke bomb and then began shooting. He was wearing a yellow vest. He had been mumbling in the corner based on some witness reports. And this was seemingly a premeditated attack. These are the images of folks in the subway. There are many reports that as many as 29 people were injured in different ways. I'm not sure if they were all shot. You know, even though it's been over 24 hours, the information is still very limited on, how many people were really impacted. And luckily, it seems as though nobody has suffered. I think there's like one serious injury, very serious injury, but everybody has survived. This is an event that has shook New York. I woke up this morning. I literally woke up this morning to helicopters next to my window, which face the East River, if you know New York and Queens. And helicopters were circulating. And I'm thinking, what could this be? Because the day before this event, there was a man with a machete in my neighborhood who was shot down by police not too far away. Now, this is in light of a lot of conversations about expanding the budget of the police force here, which receives more money than any other police force and also more money than ever. This is in light of conversations over this public safety in New York City. But I think, for those New Yorkers who know their history, who are steeped in history of New York, I think it's important to note that it's one thing to say the city is not as safe as it used to be. It is still safer than every other city in America. And this is quite important. While there's a spike in crime compared to the last 5 or 6 years, it is still far safer than the last 4, 5, 6 decades, maybe even ever, since we've been measuring crime statistics. With that being said, there are different types of crime. And this is what's really important. There's the illusion of not feeling safe because of events like people being shoved onto the subway or slashings or a machete, a man with a machete. These are not events that are all connected, but in some ways they are. You have folks who've been locked down during COVID, who've lost their jobs. The city is extremely unaffordable. There's a housing crisis. There's a mental health crisis. We know these things. But the way that the mayor and the NYPD respond to this as if they're all gangs on the right wing, of course. There are different forms of crime that might be rooted in some of the same things. The instability, the income inequality of this city, the fact that folks can't keep consistent work, they've been locked up, they're dealing with mental health issues, and we do not provide for that. That can lead from an unhoused person who's having a really tough time, who's feeling isolated and hasn't been able to, receive help, to acting out. Yes, and it's disgusting. It needs to be dealt with. It's disgusting as we look at politicians who are not dealing with these issues that we now have stats on. We now understand the cause effect. But the other side, and this is where we have to learn from history, is, if they want to say gang violence is up and, there are more shootings, if they want to use that stat, which, yes, there is a spike. What we also learned from the crime surges, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is that there was a supply issue. People were seeking drugs more. And of course, they were pushed on many communities too. We know this very well. But right now, there is research in this area, knowing that some of the drugs that are being dealt on the streets, whatever you want to say, like this is not my argument. This is an argument being made. It's because there is an increase of consumption because of the circumstances we're under. So the underlying issue here is people are feeling insecure and frazzled and don't have a government that is there to support them. Whether you're resorting to certain drugs or alcohol, as people are drinking more now. I mean, these are stats that we all have. People are dealing with their mental health issues in different ways because we do not have a society that takes care of its people. People are dealing with their struggles in different ways, whether they're unhoused, don't have secure work, whether it's domestic abuse that's up. There are issues that we have to deal with. We have to take care of our people. The result should not be pour more money into a police force. More money into a police force that, despite having more money than most government militaries do in this country, in this world, still couldn't even make sure that all the cameras worked. And, yes, it was an MTA camera, but it was in conjunction with NYPD. Anybody who has traveled the subway in New York or lives in New York knows very well that there are police officers at many stations, that there are NYPD cameras all over the city, monitoring the city. And this is a community, Sunset Park, that is extremely working class, extremely diverse. A lot of immigrants. They don't deserve this. The result is to patrol these communities more? No. This man was unwell. He was unwell. He showed his rants on YouTube. Hundreds of rants against Mayor Adams. He was unwell and he needed help. And that is what this is about. There are people, many people, all around us, probably ourselves, who are dealing with burnout, exhaustion, frustration, worrying about the future, maybe have underlying issues. We all need to take care of each other. That is what it's about. That's what democracy is about, is taking care of each other. Our surveillance state, there's no city in America that has more surveillance than New York City. And yet, we're still in a situation like we were yesterday. And it shows how vulnerable we are. So no, we should not pour more money into the NYPD. They have all the gadgets. They have all the money. They have all the support. Take a sliver of that and make sure that we have a system that supports our people, not just in New York, but all over the country. Make sure that the unhoused have a place to go, a safe place to go. These are conversations that we're strangely just starting to have in the city. But we have the stats on what causes crime to surge. We know. We went through this before. And it's delusional if any law enforcement official wants to lump every single crime in the city together and target Black and brown communities. That's just not the truth. That's just not the truth. All right, we have a really exciting show today. We have very cool. Marcus from Left Flank Vets is back. We're going to talk about all that money being poured into the NYPD. And then we have Eric Blanc on later. He is an assistant professor at Rutgers on labor studies. And he is, of course, the author of Red State Revolt. And we're going to be talking about how Amazon's immigrant workers organized to help win on Staten Island. And a little bit later, we're going to be talking to the legal team behind Jessica Reznicek, who is a climate activist from Iowa. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years probation as an activist for events that took place around the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is a crazy story that is definitely not getting enough attention. We're going to have her legal team on to discuss. And then finally, we're going to end with a spirited conversation with Matthew Kahn, who is a provost professor of economics at the University of Southern California. He wrote a book called Going Remote, How the Flexible Work Economy Can Improve Our Lives in Our Cities. I don't know if I necessarily agree with him, but we have a good conversation about it. And you know, that's helpful. All right, guys, we will be right back with Marcus.
The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.
Talk about this a little bit more. We need to talk about this more. Marcus is a founding member of Left Flank Vets, a leftist anti-war cooperative of post 9/11 veterans fighting against military recruitment efforts. Marcus, thanks for joining us again. What's up?
How's it going? Thanks for having me on. And I mean, obviously, what happened in New York is tragic and just like another sad reminder of how crazy our society is.
And that's normal. Like humans have always, you know, this is why we have, this is why we need to take care of each other. I mean, I find it totally baffling that in 2022, you know, we can have these conversations like the solution is more police. Like we literally, like, I think there's probably a police officer for every 5 people in the city. Like, are you kidding me?
And that's, I mean, it's something where like New York City spent about like 10 billion per year on police. And, you know, that's not only just, you know, cops on the beat all the way up to, you know, pensions and then lawsuits.
Yep.
You know, that's quite a bit of money in lawsuits. But no, at the end of the day, we know that this doesn't work. We've got the absolute worst president to have in place under this time, because, you know, Joe Biden was the author of the crime bill, and we're seeing a lot of the same things. And especially what's I think very concerning is that back in the crime bill days, even the Black political class wasn't so gung-ho outwardly on more policing.
Right.
But now we are in a point where the Overton window has shifted to the right for, you know, politics in general, but we're also seeing this overlap into the Black political class. And it says, you know, like a lot when Eric Adams getting elected in the first place, using a lot of tough on crime rhetoric, but this is just going to continue. You know, a lot of the COVID funding that the federal administration has put out has gone to police departments, hiring new cops. So this is something that is going to have to be dealt with, you know, for the foreseeable future. And you know, I think part of the defund the police, you know, part of it is, I think it needs to be a little more focus of how do we get community control of police departments, and how do we
Eric
get
Adams
community
says he's
accountability?
for. I mean, this is the BS that I'm calling out here is, you know, this
well,
guy talks
Democrats
about,
say
like,
they're for a lot of things, you know.
well, he's a former Republican and he's a former cop, and so he's all over the place. He's for stop and frisk, but he wants community control. Oh, but it's not stop and frisk because it has a different title now. Oh, you got us. It was a low turnout election. It was a very split field. And it was ranked choice voting. It was not a mandate. He does not represent every single New Yorker. And I personally take offense to this because, you know, I am a New Yorker, and simultaneously, you know, this is much of this activism and organizing has come from New York because of a tradition of organizing in so many communities that have been targeted over the years because of what happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And the reason why the city is safer is not because Black and brown communities were targeted. And we know that we, New Yorkers, have had public conversations about this. This isn't like a secret leftist kind of conversation we're having in a corner. These have been part of debates. Bill de Blasio ended stop and frisk. It was very controversial at the time, but guess what? You know, all the complaints about de Blasio, the city was the safest it had ever been. Now, is that because of de Blasio? Probably not. But, like, you know, there's a lot of factors here. What I think is so grotesque about this, though, with Eric Adams, is that he's playing us like we're dumb. That's what I don't appreciate. He's saying things like, well, Black and brown communities, they want a police presence because they don't feel safe. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Adams, if you went into all these supposed communities, which, you know, are very integrated in New York, like, you know, I live next to public housing. It doesn't make it. We're not a segregated city like so many other cities in this country. So what takes place across the street from me still affects me. What takes place on my side of the street still affects the other, you know, side of the street. We are a lot more interconnected. Look at the subway. So what I want to ask him is, I'm sorry, you're going to go to supposed Black and brown communities that he talks about and ask them, do you think, you know, that you're not as safe as, say, you were in the 70s and 80s? You want more cops? Do you think that that's what? I don't buy it. I don't buy it. People are old enough to remember, you know, the 90s.
Well, this is something that within, you know, our system is so difficult because you're asked, you know, at least within like Democrats or Republicans, like, do you want more cops or more cops with tanks? You know, is kind of like the options here. And once, you know, at the end of the day, the communities don't actually get represented, you know, because that really, you know, one thing that kind of needs to be recognized is that there are dangerous communities, right? In the United States, across the world, there are people who live there who would like some type of organization that if danger is, you know, is happening, that they could interject and protect them, right? Oh. That's the idea that people have with cops. That's not how actually, you know, things actually work in practice. But then you have, you know, the secondary concern of just there are a lot of these issues that can be mitigated with a better society, right? Where housing is guaranteed, you know, there's food security, there's opportunity for employment, all these things like that are just proven, you know, there's no debate to be had anymore. Water's wet, you know, the sky's blue, and having, you know, economic opportunity and benefits makes you less likely to engage in behaviors that society is deemed as, you know, the ills, right? And so those are the things is that I think that it makes this all very difficult, is that there's, you know, the real like right answer is something that's going to have to be developed by the communities, you know, in you know, across the board. But it's going to be done in a way where these police departments are, are defunded. They're, are taking away some of the military equipment, all of the military equipment. They're taking away a lot of these fundings and stuff like that, taking away a lot of protections for accountability. There needs to be some transfer of control over the cops to the people. And then also, right, with the added benefits of more after school programs, more adult learning centers, more actual, and that's like more sites that are vested in the community and actually trying to get people to where they need to be, which is just a healthy human being that can make, good decisions and their own self-determination, right? That's what we all want. But that being provided is a difficult and long road. And really, like that's the thing, is like within our current paradigm, we really don't have a choice, electorally, we really don't have anybody that's really going to be presenting that type of true and long-term vision.
Listen, you're stripping everybody of their path to survival, right? And the lower you are on their caste system totem pole, whatever that they've decided, the harder it is for you to survive. Now, add to that, you have pre-existing mental health issues. Listen, we all have mental health issues. When we're all under stress, when we're all going through something, we make decisions differently. But if you have different types of mental health issues, obviously that can manifest in more severe ways. If you have PTSD, there's so many different factors here. It's harder for you to find the housing you may need, find the job opportunity you may need, go to the mental health facilities you may need, whatever it is, it's harder. And I will say, like, New York does have more of that infrastructure than probably any other, honestly, any other city in this country. It's not saying a lot, though. Really, it's not.
In this country, low bar.
Low bar, right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the suspected shooter was like, did he drive from out of state?
Yeah, we don't know the whole story yet, but his his addresses have been in both Philadelphia and in Wisconsin.
Which I guess, to the point though, that these things, and especially within the United States, right? This doesn't really happen in a lot of other countries. Like Americans really, like they should be more reflective on that. Mm-hmm. Is that this does not happen anywhere else. And the thing that's just really dangerous is that someone being able to travel, and I mean, Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Like people traveling distances.
And putting him up like he's some sort of model, like you two kids can be a white supremacist and get away with it. Because ultimately that's what this is. If since the George Floyd incidents, the murder, and the protests and since then, in this conversation about defunding the police, and people are having a more open and real conversation just about how much money goes into our police forces and how much is misused and how much organized white supremacy exists in these police forces and how they're protected and how the FBI is investigating. It's like something happened in the last COVID, I guess, happened where no longer are we having those conversations and it's back to law and order. It was like a snapback, don't make me wear my mask. The pharmaceutical companies are out to put 5G in us, and the election isn't real. Let's storm the Capitol, and by the way, law and order. It just flipped.
Yeah, and this is something that a lot smarter people have theorized this. In the cage of kind of like post politics, in which case mass movements can engage protests from against the Iraq War. You got things like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests. But what are the results of these things? And it's largely nothing. That these political behaviors aren't aren't resulting in an actual political action. And to your point of the danger within police departments, across the country, in the LA Sheriff's Department, these have been confirmed gangs. LA LA Sheriff's Department gangs. And when I use the term gangs, I mean these are groups within the police department or within the sheriff's department, in which case you need to enact violence in order to be entered into the gang. You get tattoos, they all of these things that you associate with gangs. And like that thing though is that the violence you need to say, like you need to kill a black or brown person and then get away with it. Like those are some of these initiations. Those are some of the tasks that are happening within police department gangs. And that's something that, and after too, is we talked with the gentleman who had actually recorded Eric Garner's murder. And I was able to ask him, was like, is there anything the police department could do? As it's, is there anything that they could do to regain your trust, right? Like money and training and all of these things. Is there anything? No, of course not. Of course not. There are some of these institutions that are beyond, beyond salvation.
Yeah. And that's the thing about Eric Adams is he thinks you just train them a little bit better. How do you this is not like, okay, I'm sure there are some police officers who join the police force, their dad was an officer, whatever, and they are, yes, there are some New Yorkers, there's diversity in the police force, but the rotten part that's really, transforming, those people, they're not joining, they're beyond, like, they're indoctrinated, Yeah. You just gotta separate.
And that's the thing is that, the quote unquote good cops are silenced or they're kicked out or they're harassed to the point that they leave.
Right.
That's what happens. And this is a crazy thing too, is that like when they keep saying like, oh, it's a few bad apples, like finish the saying.
Yes,
finish the saying.
A few bad apples.
Like you're agreeing with us.
I also feel the same thing about CEOs. I think they're sociopaths. They're like driven by quarterly profits. You have to be an actual sociopath to not understand that our like planet is going to implode in like a T minus like 5 quarters, and it doesn't matter if you made the money. Like,
I'm a socialist. Like CEO should not exist. That's just not a position that should be had. A board of directors that has no accountability to the workforce should not exist. These things just shouldn't be. So
there's sociopaths.
Get rid of them.
Like it is. I think I listen to these people. It's like Elon Musk. I'm like, you're a sociopath. Like nowhere, you can't really socialize with normal people. Let's just start off with that. People think you're a genius, even though you didn't really create anything. Like Steve Jobs, he was a very problematic person in many ways. But at the end of the day, Steve Jobs, like, I can order my eggs from this. I can, organize protests from this. You can organize fascism from this. You do a lot of things from this. That came from this little brain. That created something, good and bad. But Elon Musk is an actual he just was like a wealthy kid who was like, I have an idea. And then there you go. I don't know.
Well, you got Ma and Pa just owning a little, countryside emerald mine in South Africa.
Right.
And like after that, he was just able to pull himself up by his bootstraps or something like that. Like, yes. And like the thing is, too, it's like he has no credit for any of the actual technologies that like make Tesla not profitable anyway. Like, this is the thing that doesn't make any sense. What? The company isn't even profitable. It gets government subsidies to even hold water. So yeah, I don't get it. But I am sorry for the amount of Elon Musk weirdos who are going to jump in your replies and try and defend him, because
I don't care. If you're spending your time defending him and not defending everybody who really does need defense in this country, then that's your problem. Like, I'm sorry. Like, there's a point where you don't stand in the middle. There's not the
worst part of Elon, but the most annoying part are the Elon Sims.
Well, he does pay for bots. I mean, that's the other thing. Is like, what is real on Twitter?
My anger. That's all.
My anger. All right, Marcus. Thank you so much. David's like, be careful when you go after him. Like, I don't care. It's Elon Musk.
Thank you for having me, and shout out to David, the hardest working producer.
Oh,
in left
for
media.
real. That's so funny you say that, because I was
Absolutely.
thinking that when I came in. I was like, David works so hard. I just posted a picture about how I'm like totally burned out. And here's David, just running lots of shows, getting up early, going to bed late, staring at screens. Like I can't, my brain starts to fry.
Maybe David
and
is the
dealing with
robot.
insane people like us. Maybe David is a robot. David, are you a robot?
You got to tell us legally.
Legally, I need that in writing. Are you a robot?
Okay, well, thank you for having me again.
Debatable, he says. Sorry, guys. We're looking at a screen and waiting for David to respond. Thank you so much, Marcus. Always love having you on. Went by so fast.
Yeah, quick one. Thanks. Bye.
All right, take care. We will be right back right after this little break with Eric Blanc. Welcome back to Nomiki Show. Eric Blanc is joining us once again. He is the assistant professor at Rutgers for Labor Studies, the author of Red State Revolt and Revolutionary Social Democracy, founder of the Labor Politics Substack, and an organizer with Emergency Workplace Organizing. Has a piece out right now titled How Amazon's Immigrant Workers Organized to Win a Union on Staten Island. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
So great, exciting times for the labor movement, and this was not an easy win. Let's just start off with like, this doesn't happen accidentally. They already had one loss. What was it about Staten Island, in your opinion, that kind of created the perfect storm to take on Amazon this time around?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think that it's one that people are going to be grappling with over the coming weeks and months. So this is a tentative first take based off of a lot of interviews I've done and being on the ground. The combination of, on the one hand, really classic organizing techniques with a level of passion and dedication of the organizers, with catching by Amazon by surprise, I think that's the confluence of factors that really explains this remarkable victory. Because on the one hand, there were some takes out there on the online world that Amazon labor union was just sort of barbecued, and it by breaking with all the previous labor movement tactics, they won somehow. And in fact, what came out quite clearly when you speak to the workers, particularly inside, is they did a lot of things that labor unions do when they're successful. They had just countless conversations with workers, talking to them about what a union would bring, asking them what questions they had, answering their questions, tracking their measure of support, kind of just classic basic organizing techniques. But they combined that with the fact that they had this really remarkable crew of young organizers who weren't connected to any existing union and who had a fire in their belly to bring about change in Amazon. And it was infectious. And it's really remarkable when you meet these folks, people like Chris Smalls, Angie Maldonado, and others. You can see why their coworkers might want to be part of a organization with them, because they're true believers in the best sense. They're trying to bring change to their coworkers. They're not they're not getting paid for this. They're really just in it for all the best reasons. And I think that was a little infectious, and they spent a lot of time. They really sacrificed. This core group of organizers spent a lot of time organizing these past months, and were able to eventually flip thousands of workers to support the union. And then finally, I do think they caught Amazon by surprise. It wasn't just the media that didn't see this coming, but I think Amazon was a little bit going through the motions with the union busting. Yeah. They were, they didn't pull out all of the stops. They did the terrible union busting they always do, which is quite a lot. So I don't think we should underestimate, what was accomplished and how hard it was to win, even in these conditions. They spent millions of dollars on union busting. That being said, it wasn't a scorched earth campaign. And I think we're going to start potentially seeing Amazon resorting to scorched earth campaign like Starbucks is starting to do now that they realize, oh, yeah, this is real. They lost and they're not going to try to lose again. So I think that explains what happened, but it also explains why it's going to take even more organizing to continue winning.
It also calls more attention to them. The scorched earth campaigns, I mean, when Howard Schultz, and granted Howard Schultz is a unique individual who seems to always put his foot in his mouth, but when Howard Schultz gets up there and they think, I mean, for whatever reason, Starbucks thinks he's the best advocate, maybe for advertising Starbucks, but when speaking to workers, he seems to always get it a little bit wrong. It's not great advertising for them either. In a weird way, it's like they're sort of, I guess this is very common in politics, like, do you acknowledge your opponent or do you not? And if you do acknowledge, you're actually giving them more attention. If you don't acknowledge them in the right way, if you don't, have the right messaging, you might actually feed their movement more. Listen, I mean, they tried this once before in Staten Island. And of course, Bessemer, they did go scorched earth. They went very hard. But I'm curious, was there a dynamic being in New York, right? We're all in New York here. This is the media capital of the world. There's a ton of progressive organizing in New York. Whether or not those organizations or those folks got involved or didn't get involved, just the culture, the dynamics, the like, oh, I've seen this happen in different ways, right? There's so many unions here, whether they were supportive or not in the beginning. There's just this culture of like, this is doable. It's not, there's no Stockholm syndrome like attached to it that maybe folks in the South, even though Bessemer did have a legacy and a history of labor, it's still the South. You're still dealing with like right to work state dynamics. Do you think that like kind of played a role in this?
Definitely, and I think that's a really good point you make, and it's one that hasn't really been highlighted enough. So I'm glad you brought it up. I definitely think one of the reasons you didn't see the same exact level of intensity of scorched earth anti-union activities is the political context here is different, and there's two big ways it's different. One is New York is a union town, and so what that means on the one hand is a lot more Amazon workers come from union families. One of the remarkable things that came out to me doing interviews with some of these core organizers, both Angie Maldonado, who's the chair of the Workers Committee Inside, and Chris Smalls, who is the famous now president of the union who founded it. Both of them have mothers who are unionized hospital workers in New York City. And so on the one hand, then you have a union context that makes the scare tactics just not ring as true because a lot of people already have experience. They know unions are powerful in New York, so it doesn't seem so alien. And then on the other hand, I do think your intuition there is right. We don't know what these conversations are looking like at Amazon, but there was a lot of backlash when Chris Smalls got fired in 2020. So we should keep that in mind. They did fire a worker for organizing a walkout in 2020 around health and safety. And there was a lot of backlash. Chris Smalls, that's sort of what got it all started. There was a lot of media. He was able to connect, get support from Bernie and from AOC, to her credit at the time. A lot of the progressive and even liberal infrastructure gave a spotlight to Chris when that firing happened. And I do think that plays a role in Amazon probably being reticent to resort to more firings immediately, things like that would make them look even worse. And, they nominally call themselves a progressive company. This is one of the contradictions of all of these corporations right now. On the one hand, they're like cartoonishly evil, but on the other hand, they do have a brand that nominally is cares about the world and all of this sort of veneer. And they're hesitant to give too much weapons to workers and unions to break that image. So I think what you said is true, and it remains to be seen then over the next 2 weeks when there's another vote coming up at the Staten Island warehouse LDJ5, whether they will remain hemmed in or whether they're going to escalate. And so far, it does look like they are escalating their union busting techniques.
I mean, the other side of this is Amazon has also been defeated in 2018-19. they tried to open up the headquarters and were pushed out of town and bought billboards against, you mentioned AOC. They bought billboards attacking AOC and Senator Janaris, and I live in this district where that happened. And, they were on the front pages of the newspapers, just incessantly. This is a union town, but like these are right-wing rags that we read every day. And their faces were on the front page. Amazon was going after them. You don't respect workers, you don't want jobs coming to the city, all the rhetoric. But with all that, they were still successful in pushing out the headquarters, which came with major tax breaks out of New York. So they don't have a great record in the city. But even before all of that, New York has had a history of, making sure that like Walmart doesn't exist. There is this organizing effort, with unions or without, sort of like a NIMBY kind of progressive NIMBY way of looking at things that is, it's become more matured, I think, over the last few years as left organizing has connected the dots between like these corporations coming into your backyard and killing small businesses and also receiving massive tax breaks and not providing all of the promises that they've made. So with that being said, like what does come next? And you write about immigrants in particular, and I'm fascinated about this dynamic and just what Amazon can do.
Right. So on the immigrant piece, one of the fascinating parts of the union drive was how they were able to connect together workers from dozens of different nationalities. I did an interview with a worker leader named Brima, and he's an African immigrant, and he was able to connect with folks from all across the spectrum, not just French and Arabic speakers, but Chinese and Polish workers. He was very proud of his efforts. He created these viral WhatsApp groups that immigrant workers used, in which he was able to communicate. And so there was an infrastructure built to unite workers across their differences. And given the really tremendous racist offensive against Chris Smalls, they called Chris Smalls a thug and all of this. It was, it is a very significant win that they were able to bring such a wide group of folks together. So that on the one hand, we see that kind of desire and ability to build multiracial unity on a working class basis is a very hopeful sign. It's a sign that, despite all of the things that are being used to keep working class people divided, that union organizing in particular is one of the best ways, if not the best way, to bridge those gaps, because you can, independently of who you voted for. There were some Trump voters. I met a Trump voter in the Amazon warehouse who became a key union organizer. He says, well, we disagree on the politics, but on this, we all deserve better wages. We all deserve job security. And I'm with the Amazon labor union. So you have those types of dynamics in the labor struggle. And it's one of the reasons why Amazon is going to try to crush this, because the potentiality for workers building power by taking on Amazon, it's just such an inspiring story. If the workers at Amazon could take on the management and win with very few resources, well, workers all across the country are looking at that and saying, why can't we do the same? Both in Amazon and in other industries, right? The labor market is tight. The conditions for a labor upsurge seem to be already here. You see Starbucks popping off. So does seem like we're in a moment potentially at the beginning of a significant historic upsurge in labor organizing. But I will just, word of caution, the people that workers are up against are extremely powerful. And this shouldn't be underestimated. The first real test for the Amazon labor union after this recent win will be at LDJ5. There's a union vote just later this month and starting in 10 days at the sorting center, which is just literally down the block from the warehouse in which they won. And as I mentioned earlier, Amazon is going very hard there. They're really ramping up their intimidation tactics. And so this is going to be an important test case to see whether the Amazon labor union is able to really start scaling up, or whether it's going to take a lot more kind of preliminary building, even just to win at JFK a contract. So the extent to which this is going to spread like wildfire, in part depends on what happens at this next vote in 2 weeks. So a lot of it's still in play, and we'll see. It also depends on what happens with workers in other parts of New York and Amazon. It's going to be very hard to win a first contract just in these two warehouses. this is a really crucial thing for people who are watching to understand. Just voting for a union in the United States does not guarantee you a contract, because labor law here is so messed up.
Right.
The major way that corporations get out of really recognizing unions is they just wait out the process of recognizing contract. They don't bargain in good faith. And so that's certainly what they're going to try to do. Amazon has already challenged the union election votes. They're going to try to bring it into the courts. And so in that context, given how bad labor law is currently, although there's some promising signs from the NLRB, which is in charge of sort of determining labor law, despite all of that, it's going to ultimately come down to the ability to raise the costs of disruption so high that Amazon is forced to concede, because if they don't meet the union's demands, the level of potential strikes and organizing will exceed the costs of recognizing the demand. So unless you build that kind of power on a regional level, it's hard to imagine Amazon folding.
Other unions, RWDSU and in Bessemer, they're actually based here in New York, are, even though ALU is an independent union, and maybe that's part of their success, is that there weren't other dynamics in play. But are other union leaders offering support in terms of what to expect, what strategies, they seem to be kind of using the same strategies over and over. Jane McAlevy's been on several times recently, and she's said, it seems like we know their tricks, but even when we do know their trick, they're still tough. Like they go personal. They hire folks sometimes to follow folks around. I mean, it's definitely psychological warfare as well as just classic union busting. But is there anything? Does it seem like the other unions, more established unions, are maybe quietly working with ALU or others?
Yeah, well, quietly and not so quietly. It was exciting to see that Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer, the president and VP of the ALU, went to DC just a couple of days ago to meet with the new president of the Teamsters Union, because there's a new, more militant leadership that's ready to actually take on management rather than just make backroom deals, Sean O'Brien. And O'Brien met with the ALU leaders and basically promised resources, not saying we're going to try to merge, we're not going to try to get into a turf war with you. We're going to try to give you the resources and kind of back end support you all need to keep on winning. So that is a really, really good sign. And I think the ALU is at this point looking to scale up as itself, but looking to partner with unions in the sense of getting those types of resources, lawyers, whatever is going to be necessary to partner. And they are, I think, to their credit, the ALU are looking to people who have a lot of organizing experience and experience with labor law. They're not just doing this on their own. Clearly, the fact that they're an independent union is a big part of their appeal. They're worker-led. This is a major aspect of how they were able to counter Amazon's argument that the union was a third party. So on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, to their credit, the ALU leaders are leaning on labor strategists who've been around. They're having these conversations. They're trying to think through. They're really trying to not have to reinvent the wheel, because people have been through these types of struggles. And I think, as we'll see in the upcoming weeks, especially now that Amazon is not going to be caught by surprise again, that's going to require a level of sort of systematic organizing and power building that requires learning from the experience of others and other organizations, and requires more resources. And that's going to be one of the dilemmas for ALU moving forward, is on the one hand, how do you scale up while maintaining that kind of worker-led charm? It's not so easy, because on the one hand, you want to scale up, but then you're not going to have a context in which the union president is just going to be on the phone every day talking to every single worker. That's a good problem to have when you need to be able to be big enough that you have staff, things like that. There's no way around that kind of institutionalization. The question is, how do you combine institutionalization with militancy? And it can be done, but it's not easy.
And it definitely helps if you have a leader who comes from the ranks. It's not, swooping in from professional class. That definitely helps. They feel it. Listen, Chris personally felt the wrath of Amazon. I mean, we all saw the emails. It's outrageous, and it's racist, and it's classist, and it's frankly supremacist. So the things that said, on paper, thought whatever. It was just, there was no clear indication of how these leaders really feel about their workers than that. But Eric, thank you so much for joining us and catching us up on everything happening in the Amazon organizing efforts. And there's so much more to discuss. So would love to have you back on, because there's now other other Amazon workers who are organizing around the country, and whether they're going to use the same model, we don't know, but a very, very exciting time. Thank you so much.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, we'll be right back after this short break. We are going to be talking about a woman named Jessica Reznicek, who is a climate activist from Iowa, who is sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for being an activist, a climate activist. We're going to be right back after this break to talk to her legal team and some activists supporting her. Y'all, I know we do these plugs all the time, but maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is the moment. You've been watching our show, listening to our show, you support us on different platforms. We are doing hard work. Like, being independent media is tough. So how do we support ourselves when the algorithms switch overnight, when people get shadow banned, when they try to break apart movements? Well, we have this thing called Patreon, and Patreon has been a lifesaver for us. If you are a patron, first off, thank you. If you've been a patron and you had to put, pause during COVID, we totally understand, but we would love to keep you part of our Patreon community. In fact, we're doing a big Q&A that you definitely want to tune into, and folks have been sending out really interesting and big questions that I have to prepare for, actually, for our special Q&A with our patrons that's happening this week. But join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. If you're a former patron who wants to take a pause, email us at thenomikishow@gmail.com. If you want to sponsor a patron, you can jump in there. You can write a little note. We'll make that happen. We have this really incredible community that's keeping this going, and it's been hard work because Google and Facebook, you've probably heard it from every single host, that the algorithms are switching drastically. But luckily, we do have a podcast, and the podcast has been strong and level, and it's because of our amazing community. Please join us in our community. Please join us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. And we're also out on all the platforms now, all the different podcast platforms. You can share them. You can go on social, tell your friends. That's how this works. It's a community. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Oof, I am battling my allergies right now. I apologize to folks. My voice is very scratchy. We have it's cherry blossom season, and it is hitting me super hard. All right. Well, our next guests are. This is such an interesting case, and we've covered a lot of these kinds of cases. Probably most notably with Steven Donziger, who's a dear friend, dear friend of the show and dear friend, it seems so long ago since the Dakota Access Pipeline protest at Standing Rock. I was there, and it feels like there was never any sort of resolution afterwards. Things just started to escalate under Trump. But you may recall that there were many climate activists who were arrested, and where those stories went, never really was covered in the media. Well, Jessica Reznicek is part of the Catholic worker movement and a climate activist from Iowa. On June 29th, 2021, she was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years probation and a restitution of $3 million paid for a series of attacks on DAPL. She was designated a domestic terrorist. Well, we have her attorney, Bill Quigley, who's a professor emeritus teaching at Loyola Law in New Orleans, and Alex Cohen, an old friend of mine from working Puerto Rico. There's just so much intersectional stuff here. Climate justice organizer and friend of Jessica's, and a member of the campaign to free Jessica Reznicek. Hey, everyone. How you doing?
Great. Thank you for having us.
Hi, good to see you.
Hey, Alex. So let's sort of just give context to what happened. I mean, I think most of our audience remembers Standing Rock and what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. But I don't know, maybe let's start with Alex as an activist. Remind folks what happened in the fall of 2016, and then after Trump got elected, then what?
Yeah, so we saw an unprecedented mobilization of direct action against a 4-state-long pipeline, largely led by the indigenous community up at Standing Rock in North Dakota. But people also fought in all 4 states that the pipeline crossed through. And Jessica, who we're talking about here, Jessica Reznicek, she was actually from Iowa. And so she went and ran with the Lakota youth, which kind of started this mobilization against the pipeline from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. to try and get Obama to cancel the pipeline. Obviously, Obama didn't. And so then they called for people to come to North Dakota and Standing Rock. And that's where Jessica went. And she kind of realized, hey, a pipeline's going through a majority of my home state, Iowa. I'm going to go home and fight this here. And that's where she did. You can see in this picture here, she set up in front of where they were drilling underneath the Mississippi River. She was by herself in the middle of the night. She set up tires and blockaded the road and said, I'm not leaving. And the police came, arrested her. She got out 24 hours later, and she did it again. They arrested her, and she got out 24 hours later, and she said, where can I stand without being arrested? And they pointed to the ditch. And so she set up camp and asked people to join her, and eventually hundreds of people would come and join her and be a part of this, direct action campaign in Iowa to protect the Mississippi River.
Bill, she kept getting arrested. When they arrested her in the beginning, what were the reasons?
So thanks again for having us on here, and I appreciate it. Jessica and her partner in the action, Ruby Montoya, announced that they had engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience and property destruction trying to stop the pipeline. They did that in front of the Iowa Public Utilities Board. You can see on the screen there, they announced what they had done, and they started taking the letters off of the Public Utilities Board. They were arrested and brought to jail, and they were released shortly after, and waited a couple of years before the federal government finally prosecuted them for a series of actions against the pipeline itself. They taught themselves how to use an acetylene torch, and they went and found empty parts of the pipe, cut holes in the pipeline, and then they also found equipment that was used, was going to be used to dig the pipeline and to put that in the ground and destroy the property. And they destroyed that property themselves. And they did that over a series of months in places in Iowa, and then ultimately announced that they had done it, and announced that they were activated by the Standing Rock activities, and that they stood in solidarity with their sisters and brothers all across the nation who were trying to stop the pipelines from destroying our Earth. And so the federal government ended up charging them with 9 major felonies each. And for all the various places where they had done damage, most of which they had admitted to, both in front of the Iowa Public Service Commission and on libraries and gatherings around, and sometimes on the media as well. And they originally thought that they might try to put the government on trial in their trial, but they were facing what probably was more than 100 years in prison if they were found guilty of the activities that they were accused of. And they had admitted to a lot of that already. So Jessica and Ruby both pled guilty to one of the counts, and they were looking at probably 3 or 4 years in prison because there was quite a bit of damage that was done. But at her sentencing, Jessica read a statement explaining how she had always been close to the earth. She'd had a hard time growing up, and that the outside and the rivers and the wildlife had really been part of her family and part of her friendship circle. And then the federal judge announced that, well, she thought that given the amount of damage that had been done, probably it was a sentence in the range of 3 or 4 years. But she went on to say that I have decided that you were engaged in terrorism activity. And so therefore I am going to enhance your sentence, essentially doubling it to 8 years, because she, in the words of the court, threatened the government, and she did this to force the government to act. And Jessica Reznicek, has engaged in civil disobedience before, has engaged in actions that, damage property, never damaging a person, never putting an individual at risk. But this is just an outrageous miscarriage of justice. And we're fortunate that we got a very excellent, experienced federal public defender out of Minnesota to handle the appeal itself. The appeal is coming up. It's originally scheduled in May, maybe a little bit later than that, asking the court to say, look, terrorism, we understand what terrorism is. Terrorism is Timothy McVeigh. Terrorism is ISIS. Terrorism is 9/11, those sorts of things. But nonviolent civil disobedience, where the only thing that damages property, is not terrorism. And if it is, then that is a very ugly and very powerful tool that the government can use against thousands of people in this country who choose to trespass, who choose to do graffiti, who choose lots of things to do. And so that is the sort of the legal struggle that's going on. At this point, Jessica is in prison. She's in the Bureau of Prisons right now and has begun to serve her sentence. Her co-defendant is still awaiting sentencing.
It's interesting because it does set a precedent. I mean, I'm so glad you clarified terrorism, because, she was not her goal, and she did not, regardless, I mean, goal or not, like, there was no violence against any human. The footage we saw is taking letters off of a sign, for those who are listening on podcast right now, and also what kind of precedent does this create for free speech and freedom to organize, and basically the most basic tenets of whatever's left of our democracy. It says quite a bit. I mean, Alex, as an organizer who knows her, what she did, was this unusual? Was this part of just the typical organizing you guys have been doing over the years? Same tactics?
It was different in the sense that it was in terms of the Standing Rock movement, that it directly targeted to damage the pipeline, but it wasn't necessarily different from the rage we saw, the righteous rage we saw from the George Floyd protests this past summer. It seems like as conditions tend to get worse, there's an escalation from people. And so in comparison to the climate crisis and the doubling down on fossil fuels, Jessica did something extremely reasonable. And she didn't harm anyone in the process, nor did she threaten to harm anyone in the process. And I think another thing that's important is that in terms of, the climate justice movement hasn't harmed any individuals in their actions. But what happened to Jessica and the terrorism enhancement didn't happen in a silo. It followed basically state legislators passing critical infrastructure laws after the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. And those laws increased criminal penalties for people that simply trespass, making trespass on a pipeline easement just to stage a sit-in or something like that, as a felony. And so dozens of states have passed these laws, and the use of the terrorism enhancement is not something that, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's not something a judge can do on their own. The Department of Justice has to ask a judge to do it, and then a judge can agree to do it. And so in this case, it didn't just happen because the judge sought it. And the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions at the time, didn't just do it because he wanted to do it. He did it because 80 Republicans and 4 Democrats, who are all funded by the fossil fuel industry, wrote a letter in 2017, a public letter, and they asked Jeff Sessions to prosecute not just Jessica Reznicek and Ruby, but also the valve turners, the elderly valve turners who did stuff against the Keystone Pipeline, also from the Catholic worker tradition, asked all of them to be prosecuted as domestic terrorists. And since the valve turners were state charges and not federals, the department, Jeff Sessions didn't. But because Jessica was in the federal court, then Jeff Sessions answered to the interest of the fossil fuel industry and these Republicans and 4 Democrats who represent them, and went ahead and pursued the terrorism enhancement.
So now that it's Merrick Garland, who you guys can't see me rolling my eyes on podcast, but who's just been so courageous in reversing so many Jeff Sessions' positions. But it is the Biden administration, and there is a public conversation about being less reliant on oil, mainly because of our escalation with Russia at this point. But okay, let's take that at face value. Is there a place where Merrick Garland could intervene? Is there a place for activists to apply pressure? I mean, she's not from like let's use Stephen Donziger, for instance. His story, he was sitting in New York courts, and it is so egregious because it's like it flies in the face of everything, But in a right-wing government, you see, okay, I can understand how they get away with it because the institutions support right-wing policies and state legislatures are backing it up. But, now that we have a Democratic president, is there something that can be done? Go to Bill for them.
So in terms of the legal process, the Department of Justice can always change their mind. So they have the ability to pull down the enhancement that they had asked for. They'd have to ask for permission from the court, but they can do that. They as Alex pointed out, they advocated very strongly for this terrorism enhancement. Yeah. The other thing is that they can make the conditions under which she's imprisoned not reflect the fact that she's categorized as a terrorist. And then the president himself obviously has the power of the office to shorten anybody's sentence, to pardon anybody that he chooses to, and that's unreviewable by any courts or by the Congress itself. So there are plenty of things that the federal government can do to back off and back away from what they have done in this case. I think it's important to recognize that I've heard people say, well, look, maybe they did millions of dollars worth of damage. They have to be punished. Well, they're not saying don't punish us. They're saying, punish us according to the way that nonviolent property damage is done. She was never accused of being a terrorist. She didn't plead guilty to being a terrorist. The whole idea of terrorism came after the fact that she pled guilty to the damages, and then the federal government, and with the assistance of the court, went ahead and said, no, we are going to say that what you were engaged in was domestic terrorism. And I think that is a hard time passing the laugh test. But in courts, as you know, lots of things that seem crazy on the outside are taken very, very seriously on the inside. Another point that I'd like to make is, this country was founded on nonviolent property damage and civil disobedience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Boston Tea Party, the act of Declaration of Independence itself was not always nonviolent. It was certainly civil disobedience and breaking the law. And throughout our history, the nonviolent civil disobedience has been a part of every transition and every social justice campaign. It's not the only part. It's an important part. Legislative part is important. Media, organizing, door to door, all these things are important. But we ought to recognize this as part of the process of change.
Oh, I think we just lost Bill. Alex, why don't you pick up from there? We'll wait for Bill to reconnect. Yep. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and also to your question earlier, I think and to what Bill was saying is, I think it's important to remember that Jessica came out of the Catholic worker tradition, and in that sense, the plowshares movement in this tradition of nonviolent property destruction, Jessica's actions do fall in line with that tradition that she was kind of acting in. And one thing the Catholic workers have always done is owned up to what they did, and that's exactly what Jessica did. And she was ready to, take responsibility for the consequences. And just like Bill said, she's not trying to get, necessarily no time at all. She is just trying to overturn this terrorism enhancement. And that is kind of what the petition that we made with Jessica before she went into prison, that, over 100 organizations have signed out, including 350.org, Rainforest Action Network, Sunrise Movement, people from the peace movement like Code Pink and Veterans for Peace. I mean, really a broad-based coalition of people have said, hey, look, whether or not we agree with what Jessica did, whether or not we even think it was violent or nonviolent is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the fact that Jessica is not a terrorist. And if she is a terrorist, then many of us are, lined up to be next by the federal government to be called terrorist based on the things they used in the federal court to designate her as one.
Yeah, and I would point out one other thing too is that this terrorism enhancement is openly being discussed against Black Lives Matter protests, openly being discussed against other sorts of animal rights protests, of lots of things, as a clear effort to intimidate protesters, a clear effort to hyper-criminalize the activities that people are willing to engage in. As part of this is that, as Alex was referring to earlier, the state of Louisiana changed its law from trespass, a misdemeanor, to a felony if you trespass anywhere around a pipeline. And they arrested 15 people on the extension of the Dakota Access Pipeline through Louisiana, which was called the Bayou Bridge Pipeline at that point. And it took 3 years to be able to clear those felonies off of those folks. And they're suing the federal government now to try to invalidate the law itself because it serves no useful purpose. And the other point about this is that politically, the DAPL pipeline people are joined at the hip with the Trump administration and have used same lawyers that he used, although these days Trump has used so many lawyers that, sort of not a thing of distinction anymore to share a client with Donald Trump. But and the head of the pipeline company made a public address that was carried in the Wall Street Journal saying that these two women ought to be removed from the gene pool.
Unbelievable.
For daring to try to slow down and stop the literal rape of the earth and the destruction of our water and our species and the like. And it's just like they are the people who are doing us a favor by destroying our environment and continuing the pillaging and that. And it's a horrendous thing. And Jessica, fortunately, is a very peaceful person, but she's a person of high principle, and she's stood up for her principles time and time again. And she doesn't regret what she's done. And she told the judge that she said that she wouldn't do it again. And she's in prison. She would rather not be in prison for 8 years, but she's doing the best that she can and standing up, inspiring all of us.
On screen, there was a note from Jessica and just what she's going through right now. Alex, where is she? What's the condition like? How is she feeling? Have you been in touch?
Yeah, so she's in Waseca, Minnesota, in the federal prison there. It's still a prison, but luckily it's not a high security prison. That's another thing that this terrorism designation can do, is that it can change not just your sentence length, but also where the Bureau of Prisons places you, and whether that's in a supermax, a high security facility with very little time out. So luckily Jessica's not in there right now. She's in a low security, but it's still prison. COVID has been extremely hard. I know she said recently she resonated a lot with a piece she read from Leonard Peltier, who's been in prison for decades now, who said out of, all his decades in prison under COVID has been the hardest. So even as things are opening back up on the outside, on the inside, there's still an extreme isolation, not getting out, not being allowed to go outside, and things like that has made it really tough. And so she's hoping that starts to lift soon, some of those COVID restrictions.
All right. So is there anything folks can do? I mean, we're fighting a legal system that is, really changing the rules midway, but what can folks do? I mean, there's a petition, as you mentioned. Bill, do you have any advice? Alex, just chime in. Feel free to share.
Yeah, the first thing is to sign up at the petition. That way you'll be able to stay in touch with what the developments are. I think at this point that Jessica's asking that we go forward with the appeal and try to do what the courts will allow. And if the courts can address this, then all fine and good. We'll come back for resentencing. If the courts can't address this, then we will go ahead and ask the president, and we'll have a campaign to ask the president to be able to pardon her or to cut her sentence in half. And even then, it's not just, and she would be the first to say it, it's not just about Jessica. It is about fighting this for Black Lives Matter, for Indigenous people, for other people who are protesting, so that we retain the right to be able to stand up and gain attention to the injustices that are cascading over us in the United States. So it's tough. It's really tough, but on the website they have her mailing address. You can send her a card in prison. That always helps people in prison. But what we need to do is to change the system. We need to use this campaign to change the system so that it doesn't create other Jessicas, and does something to try to help all the people who are fighting against not just climate injustice, but racial injustice, police injustice, all the various things, campaigns that we're fighting across the country.
Yeah, and just everything Bill said, and just to add that, from a climate justice organizing perspective, and like many news organizations have been put out, like many of us in the movement are watching this as a test as to whether or not water protectors in the US will be officially designated as terrorists. And so, like Bill said, it's much bigger than Jessica. Jessica sees it that way as well. Before she went into prison, after her sentencing, luckily she was allowed to self-report months later. So we were able to kind of make this petition together. She was, able to talk with different organizations before she went in and start making these connections. Coming up next week, actually, on Tuesday, we're having a webinar. And this webinar is going to try and highlight this connection, right, from Donziger to the critical infrastructure bills to the terrorism enhancement being used, and people can register for that webinar
where is it?
On our social media, which is like at Free Jess Rez, FREEJESSREZ, and people can register there. And that's going to be the best way to get involved. Yeah, that and signing the petition. If you're an organization, please sign on to her petition as well and send it out to your networks. We are definitely growing. And I know it's from Donziger and these critical infrastructure laws, and my friend or your friend, or seeing yourself in Jessica being called a terrorist. It can seem like a lot, and it is a lot, and it is sad, and it is scary, but I really do have hope for her appeal, because I feel like in an unprecedented way, people are making these connections, and large, big green orgs are showing up and saying, you know what's happening, Jessica, is not okay and could even happen to us. And these are people who don't even engage in any type of direct action. And so that does give me hope.
And there are other organizations who have joined in amicus briefs, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Water Protectors Legal Front, the Center for Climate Disobedience, and many other groups that recognize that this is not just an injustice to her, but it is a threat to all of us who are willing to put ourselves on the line and put our future and our time on the line. Alex was arrested himself in Louisiana as part of this thing, and so are many other people. So this could be, any one of us at any time, and we need to encourage and support the people who are courageous enough and whose life is such that they can take these actions, and support Jessica, but to support all of these campaigns that people are fighting. 100%.
And it's, and it's a faith, she's part of faith-based organization. And that's also another element to this where, we often, the right wing tries to own faith-based organizations, but there is so much part of the peace movement, nonviolent protest that is rooted in that. So, all right. Well, folks know where to go. Please keep us keep in touch with us about what's happening, what we can do. This is just, it's tragic. We hope she stays safe, especially given, COVID rates spiking once again. And please reach out to us in any way just to keep us informed about her case.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
so much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Alex. And thank you to everybody listening. All right. We will be right back with our next guest. We're going to be talking about how the work economy can improve our lives by working in a flexible workplace, going remote. There's some goods, it's not a debate. It's just a discussion. This is a new conversation based off of how the economy shifted under COVID. So I definitely urge you to listen with an open mind and check it out. There's a lot to learn. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Matthew Kahn is a provost professor of economics at the University of Southern California and senior fellow and director of the Health Markets Initiative at the Schaefer Center. Also the author of Going Remote, How the Flexible Work Economy Can Improve Our Lives and Our Cities. This is a very new conversation, Matthew. I don't really know where I stand on it, to be honest, but I'm going to hear you out because every day I open up the paper, because I still do that, even though I'm a millennial. I open up the paper and it's like, Goldman Sachs wants you to come back into the office. Morgan Stanley wants you to stay at home. I don't know where capital is. All I know is I film out of my apartment, and I just like that I'm finally using my apartment that I pay for in New York City. So what was the inspiration behind this?
Thanks so much for inviting me on. So back in March 2020, when my 20-year-old son came home from school, when my parents, I worried for their health, and when my wife and I, and we're both privileged academics who could work from home, as I began to think in the midst of the crisis, Nomiki, I'm an endless optimist, and I'm always looking for the silver line in everything. So I hope you're an optimist also, at least about part of the world. And I started to think, what could be a silver lining of the crisis we've had? And in my book, I tell the story of experience goods. So I don't know if you were born before 1977. I think the answer is no. But that's the year the first Star Wars movie came out. And if you had told me how much I would like that movie, I never would have guessed it. And so the theme of my book, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is the work from home experience that millions of us have experienced is this experience good effect. And we never would have guessed how much we'd gain from it. But it opens up a million new questions. And so I'm an urban economist, and my book is thinking about different types of people, young, middle-aged, old, African Americans, whites, Asians. I'm thinking about firms, Goldman Sachs, Starbucks, construction firms. And I'm thinking also about places, San Francisco, Bozeman, Baltimore, and trying to juggle all these balls and argue that work from home is going to make America stronger and is going to make us a better nation going forward, because we have very different conceptions of the good life. And I'd like to hear your conception of the good life. I can sense you have a very good sense of humor. And we have different conceptions of the good life. And recently, we all had to be in the superstar cities to access tech jobs, if that was our thing. We had much more constrained opportunity than I think we're going to have going forward. So you should know that I'm an endless optimist. And you can throw me off the podcast now if that's bad news.
No, not at all. It's. I mean, this is a conversation that we're all in some ways have experienced in some effects. I mean, not every worker has been able to stay at home. A lot of frontline workers, were really, as on the front lines of the pandemic. But, you look at cities like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and London, even, a lot of the workplaces were kind of built off of these like speculative market, these real estate markets. And I say that okay, WeWork is a beautiful example. I think folks are pretty familiar with WeWork. It's this shared office space. It's not a new concept. Shared offices have existed for a long time. It's just like the sexy new one that raised a ton of capital, was able to build these co-working spaces, which was sort of part of this new economy that formed after the financial collapse. It busted, the boom busted before the economy was hit by the COVID recession. But it also kind of is a reflection of, well, do we need those spaces now? I mean, if you can work from home, if you have the space to work from home, if there's more flexibility. And then simultaneously, there's other folks who had the privilege and ability, maybe even to leave their apartments, no longer pay rents in big cities, high rents, and move to, the South or back home, or Mexico City had a big boom with New Yorkers. How does that kind of fit into the economy too?
These are great questions. Let me start with WeWork. And I've never been to one of these WeWorks, but I kind of interpret it of sort of serendipity. Nomiki, there is a debate in urban economics right now of whether we still need face-to-face interaction. I think we both agree the answer is yes. But what WeWork did, and I realized the founder was a little bit of an unusual guy, is he had this vision that this serendipity of bringing young hipsters together and maybe an old unhipster like me at age 56 to allow serendipity of what new ideas in a Jane Jacobs Greenwich Village sense could be launched when people who are simpatico but don't know each other are in close physical proximity. And so that's an example of if we all have to be in our Dilbert cubicle, these types of serendipity won't occur, but could occur when we can work from anywhere, including from home. You made a second great point about how the ability to work from anywhere reduces stress and creates opportunity in your life. If you have a sick mother in Missouri, you can still work for Amazon. If your child has a school play in some Buffalo suburbs, you can be there that day. If there's a snowstorm in Chicago, you can be productive that day working from home if you're one of the privileged people with the ability to work from home. A dentist can't really work from home, have to go to your clients. And so Nomiki, when you think about your generation, and I think about my son, my 20-year-old son really wants to be face to face. I think he'll be mentored by middle-aged workers who want to be face-to-face with him, and there'll be new opportunities in the economy. Old, strange guys like me can sort of retreat, and there'll be, because we're diverse, we will sort of self-select, if I can use an ugly academic word, for which of us want to step into continued face-to-face interaction versus which of us want to decentralize and be in our own little bubble. But the silver lining of that is more social capital and community engagement with where we spend our time when we're not commuting.
How do we know? I mean, commuting is obviously one big factor here, and also we talked about speculative, like real estate being, a part of this. Whether it's folks who don't need to stay in their cities that are very expensive anymore and can move back home with their family and take care of their family or have a better quality of life somewhere else. But how do we know that folks aren't actually working longer hours?
So this is an excellent question. And I think we're going to need much better time diaries. So what nerds have been doing is they've been using cell phones to take pings of what's the geography. So without freaking one out about privacy, these cell phones are sending pings of where you are. So I'm sitting next to my cell phone, but I turned it off for our talk. Your question's very important. In my book, perhaps naively, I assume that we'll have more quality time. So when you have this reduction in commute times, what do you do with that extra time? Do men do more chore work at home? Do they spend more time with children? That's a testable hypothesis.
Not sure about that one.
And you're right. And you're right. My book is filled with hypotheses that may be false. And so I respect your skepticism.
Nomiki, I bring it up. I'm sorry to interrupt. I bring it up because what we do know through the pandemic is that women have been taking on more of the labor at home, which is already the case, but then it really exacerbated to the point where many women are not going to go back to the workforce because of these new dynamics that are at play.
So let me speak there. And you just said something fascinating and very important. My book is sort of set 5 years from now, and fingers crossed, it's set in our post-pandemic future, which I think we both hope exists. I argue in the book, and I want to hear your thoughts here, that persistent work from home will create new opportunities for women that for suburban women in the past, and I realize that this is a traditional cliched argument, for suburban young mothers who had children at home, it wasn't worth getting dressed up and commuting to work for a few hours before going back to kids. I argue in the book that the persistence of work from home could help to close the gender gap, that women can find intellectually stimulating work on Upwork and other platforms, and a little bit like the gig economy, find good gigs there. You raised a key counter on my wife out earns me. We need gender equality. And there's going to be a very interesting discussion in the chore wars and how all of us use these new opportunities created by remote work. Nomiki, what do you think of that? Do you give that a B+, or this is to be determined?
I don't know. I mean, there are much smarter people who are studying this stuff. I know we're still in the midst of the pandemic and still sort of processing and having these conversations. So it's obviously also it's like the type of work that drives people back to the offices. Maybe I don't know what Morgan Stanley's gender ratio is, but if they're saying you got to get back into the office, and this is just a hypothesis here. Like if it's male, like how does that, what kind of relationships are folks in? I mean, we do know that teachers, obviously, it's a primarily female workforce. Nurses, a lot of the frontline folks who weren't able to be at home. I'm curious. I think we're going to have to figure this out. And maybe it's just having these conversations. It sort of calls attention to the inequities of the chore aspect of our lives.
I agree with you. And if I can add one more point that builds on your point. Claudia Golden, the famous Harvard economist, has argued that in the past that women disproportionately were in jobs like veterinary, pharmacists, teachers, where you could come and go in the workforce. I argue in my book, perhaps conveniently because I'm a work from home booster, that the internet will open up all sorts of different opportunities for people who do such gig work on the internet. That in the past, when we had to commute physically to a workplace, that limited things to what was within a 25-minute drive from where you are. And so I argue there's going to be new freedoms and that folks won't be so stuck at home, that if you want to work, if someone at home with young kids wants to work a 3-hour shift, there can be something exciting on the internet if you're trained for that. And that creates an incentive to acquire those skills.
Right. It's very interesting. Well, how, if this is in 5 years, I mean, there's plenty of workplaces that haven't been remote, but now are choosing to stay remote. What are some examples of that?
So we're seeing this with many firms, and I think every firm is wrestling with this. And so I'm trying to get more involved with human resources. Human resources offices, as you know, of major firms are out there trying to figure out how to integrate hybrid work into their efforts. Nomiki, workers are the major cost and the major productive factor in any firm. If workers are happier at the firm and if they quit less often, the firm will have a more productive workforce. And so in this age, I know your show touches on issues of labor and capital relations. The rise of work from home opens up new possibilities of happier, more productive workers if a firm figures this out. So I'm dodging your question of naming a firm that I would give an A+ to, because this is still a work in progress. But I'd say this: every firm has its big data sets. And Nomiki, suppose that the big data nerd at a firm sees that women are disproportionately quitting the firm, and on their exit interviews, they're saying this place is not fair. That would set off a red flag to that boss that hybrid work needs to be integrated in if the firm is serious about diversity and gender equality.
Hopefully. To go back to our WeWork example, for those who are watching the WeWork show, there were a lot of red flags that weren't addressed. People were quitting because of,
But can I jump in? And keep in mind, I'm an economist, and I know that economists are not loved, but I'm married to an economist. I think she likes me. Economists would argue that because women and minorities are as productive as a white guy like me, a firm that's foolish enough to not tap into that workforce is at a cost disadvantage because it's overpaying the white guys. And so there's a debate in economics. If a firm inefficiently passes on hiring qualified minorities and women, this firm is actually losing profit and will lose in competition. What do you think of that one?
I think that if they're thinking bottom line like that, that's their mindset. They should be paying everybody equally, as you know. But I hear what you're saying from an economist perspective. If they're looking at it like through the bottom line, they should at least be incentivized to support more diversity for many reasons. But it's a really, really fascinating conversation and like one that we all have to definitely be having right now, because this is the world that we're embarking on and we're currently part of. Very fascinating. So your book, where's the best place to find it? It was published by University of California Press.
Yes.
Where is the best place to find it?
Either there on Amazon or on Google Books or University of California Press. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you so much, Matt Kahn. Going remote, how the flexible work economy can improve our lives and our cities. A fascinating conversation just out this month. Go check it out. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.
Take care. All right, we will be right back after this quick break. right, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this wonderful show. If you are a patron, first off, thank you. If you've been a patron and you had to put, pause during COVID, we totally understand, but we would love to keep you part of our Patreon community. In fact, we're doing a big Q&A that you definitely want to tune into, and folks have been sending out really interesting and big questions that I have to prepare for, actually, for our special Q&A with our patrons that's happening this week. But join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this wonderful show. We will see you on Friday for Fun Friday. I have to take some sort of antihistamine. My allergies are just hitting me super hard, and it is definitely not COVID. I know that because I have right outside of my apartment, there's 13 cherry blossoms, which are amazing, but every time I walk by them, I'm sneezing. So it's time to take an antihistamine. In the meantime, stay in solidarity.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.